Jawaharlal Nehru, an autobiography. Indira Gandhi wrote, "My father's three books, Glimpses of World History, an autobiography, and The Discovery of India, have been my companions through life. It is difficult to detach about them." The autobiography is not merely the quest of one individual for freedom, but as an insight into the making of the mind of New India. This book was written entirely in prison, except for the postscript and certain minor changes, from June 1934 to February 1935. The reader will, I hope, remember that the book was written during a particularly distressful period of my existence. I am the only son of my parents. I have two sisters, which were very much younger than I am. And so I grew up and spent my early years as somewhat lonely child with no companions of my age. I did not even have the companionship of children at school, for I was not sent to any kindergarten or primary school. Private tutors were supposed to be in charge of my education. We were Kashmiris. My childhood was thus a sheltered and uneventful one. I listened to the grown up talk of my cousins without always understanding all of it. Another of my early confidants was a Munshi of my father's, Munshi Mubarak Ali. Indian marriages, both among the rich and the poor, have had their full share of condemnation as wasteful and extravagant display. When I was 10 years old, we had a large swimming pool in the house, and soon I learned to swim and felt completely at home and under the water. Father's visit to Europe led to an internal storm in the Kashmiri Brahmin community in India. My father refused to perform any purification ceremony on his return. When I was about 11, a new resident tutor, Brooks, he was partly Irish and his mother had been a French woman or a Belgian. F.T. Brooks developed in me a taste for reading, and I read a great many English books. I remember reading many of the novels of Scott Dickens and Mark Twain, as well as Sherlock Holmes. Nationalistic ideas filled my brain. I dreamed of brave deeds, of how, sword in hand, I would fight for India and help in freeing her. In May 1905, when I was 15, we set sail for England. Father and mother, my baby sister and I, we all went to Cambridge Trinity College, the beginning of October 1907, my age 17, or rather approaching 18. I felt elated at being an undergraduate with a great deal of freedom compared to school to do what I choose. 3 years I was at Cambridge, 3 quiet years with little of disturbance in them. Many of the people I met at Cambridge or during the vacations in London or elsewhere talked learnedly about books and literature and history and politics and economics. So we discussed Nietzsche and Bernard Shaw's prefaces and the latest book by Lovis Dickinson. For the first time since the revolt of 1857, India was showing fight and not submitting tamely to foreign rule. I left Cambridge after taking my degree in 1910. I took to the law and joined the High Court. The work interested me to a certain extent. I joined the Congress and took part in its occasional meeting. World War started. There was little sympathy with the British in spite of loud professions of loyalty. My first meeting with Gandhi ji was about the time of the Lucknow Congress during Christmas 1916. All of us admired him for his heroic fight in South Africa, but he seemed very distant and different and unpolitical to many of us young men. He refused to take part in Congress or national politics then and confined himself to the South African Indian question. My marriage took place in 1916 in the city of Delhi. The end of the World War found India in a state of suppressed excitement. Industrialization had spread and the capitalist class had grown in wealth and power. Among the Muslims, there was anger over the treatment of Turkey and the Khilafat question, and an agitation was growing. Political and the Khilafat movement developed side by side during that year 1920, both going in the same direction and eventually joined hands with the adoption by the Congress of Gandhiji's non-violent non-cooperation. As for Gandhiji himself, he was a very difficult person to understand. Sometimes his language was almost incomprehensible to an average man. Right through the year 1921, individual Congress workers were being arrested and sentenced. The Ali brothers had received long sentences for inciting the Indian army. Gandhiji had pleaded for the adoption of the way of non-violence, of peaceful non-cooperation, with all the eloquence and persuasive power which he so abundantly possessed. I do believe that when there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence. I would rather have India resort to arms in order to defend her honor than that she should, in a cowardly manner, become or remain a helpless victim to her own dishonor. But I believe that non violence is infinitely superior to violence. Forgiveness is more manly than punishment. Non violence, in its dynamic condition, means conscious suffering. It does not mean meek submission to the will of the evildoer, but it means the putting of one's whole soul against the will of the tyrant. Both my father and I had been sentenced to 6 months imprisonment on different charges and by different courts. Imprisonment for political offences was not a new thing in the India of 1921. One misses many things in prison, but perhaps most of all, one misses the sound of women's voices and children's laughter. In December 1923, the annual session of the Congress was held. Maulana Muhammad Ali Jawhar was the president. He delivered an enormously long presidential address, but it was an interesting one. He traced the growth of political and communal feelings among the Muslims and showed how the famous Muslim deputation to the Viceroy in 1908 under the leadership of Aga Khan, which led to the first official declaration in favor of separate electorates, was a command performance and had been engineered by the government itself. Muhammad Ali Jawhar induced me, much against my will, to accept the All India Congress secretaryship for his year of presidentship. He had strong likes and dislikes, and I was fortunate enough to be included in his likes. A bond of affection and mutual appreciation tied us to each other. He was deeply, and I considered most irrationally religious, and I was not. But I was attracted by his earnestness, his overflowing energy, and keen intelligence. Ali Jawhar had an extraordinary way of bringing in some reference to God, even in Congress resolutions, either by way of expressing gratitude or some kind of prayer. I used to protest, and then he would shout at me for my irreligion. I avoided discussing this subject of religion with him because I knew we would only irritate each other and I might hurt him. There is a certain philosophical tradition among the intelligent Hindus which, though it does not affect practice, does make a difference to the ideological approach to a religious questions. Partly, I suppose this is due to the wide and often conflicting variety of opinions and customs that are included in the Hindu fold. It has indeed often been remarked that Hinduism is hardly a religion in the usual sense of the word. Logic of this argument was not obvious, but I had no wish to argue. What followed really surprised me. Muhammad Ali said that he was quite certain that if anyone read the Quran with an open and receptive mind, he would be convinced of its truth. He knew that Bapu, Gandhiji, had read it carefully and he must therefore have been convinced of the truth of Islam. But his pride of the heart had kept him from declaring this. In 1924, there came suddenly the news of the serious illness of Gandhiji in prison, followed by his removal to a hospital and an operation. Gandhiji had little sense of beauty, or artistry in man made objects, though he admired natural beauty. The Taj Mahal was for him an embodiment of forced labor and little more. His sense of smell was feeble. There were many Muslims in the Congress. Their numbers were large and included many able men, and the best known and most popular Muslim leaders in India were in it. At the beginning of March 1926, we sailed, my wife, our daughter, and I, from Bombay for Venice. Our stay in Europe lengthened out to a year and 9 months. It was a quiet and restful period for both my mind and body. We spent it chiefly in Switzerland, in Geneva, and in a mountain at Montana. Later, we traveled a little in France, England, and Germany. I felt completely cut off from India. In the summer of 1927, my father Motilal came to Europe. I met him at Venice, and during the next few months, we often together. All of us, my father, my wife, my young sister, and I, paid a brief visit to Moscow in November during the 10th anniversary celebration of the Soviet. It was a brief visit, just 3 or 4 days in Moscow. But we were glad we went, for even that glimpse was worthwhile. My father, all such Soviet and collective ideas were wholly novel. I was returning from Europe in good physical and mental condition. The death of Hakim Ajmal Khan was a great blow to the Congress. In the second half of 1928 and in 1929, there was frequent talk of my arrest. Gandhiji was still keeping away from politics, except for the part he played at the Calcutta Congress. He was, however, in full touch with developments and was often consulted by the Congress leader. The election was indeed a great honor and a great responsibility for me. It was often said that I was the youngest president of the Congress. I was just 40 when I presided. Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, though he is little older than me, was probably just under 40 when he presided. The Lahore Congress was attended by large numbers of people from the frontier province nearby. Individual delegates from this province had always come to the Congress sessions, and for some years past Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan had been attending and taking part in our deliberations. Gandhiji had been arrested on May 5th. Indian prisons contain, of course, hardened criminals, persons who are aggressively antisocial and dangerous to the community. My rearrest and conviction had some effect on the tempo of the civil disobedience movement for a while. My rearrest had probably been hastened because of my activities in connection with the no tax campaign. January 26, the same day that I was discharged, Gandhiji was also discharged from prison. My father Motilal died, and we brought his body that very day by car to Allahabad. I sat in that car. Behind us came another car containing my mother and Gandhiji, and then other cars. I was dazed all that day, hardly realizing what had happened, and succession of events and large crowds kept me from thinking. Many thousands of messages of sympathy came to my mother and to me. To me personally, Gandhiji had always shown extraordinary kindness and consideration, and my father's death had brought him particularly near to me. He had always listened patiently to whatever I had to say and had made every effort to meet my wishes. Buddha has always had a great appeal for me. It is difficult for me to analyze this appeal, but it is not a religious appeal, and I am not interested in the dogmas that have grown up round Buddhism. It is the personality that has drawn me. So also the personality of Christ has attracted me greatly. Compared to those selected few Anglo-Indian newspapers, the Indian newspapers are usually poor stuff. Their financial resources are limited. and there is little attempt on the part of their owners to improve them. They carry on their day to day life with difficulty, and the unhappy editorial staff has no easy time. The British owned Anglo Indian newspapers in India joined in the game of propaganda. The Indian newspapers, their get-up is poor, their advertisements often of the most objectionable kind, and their general attitude to life and politics sentimental and hysterical. Partly, I suppose this is due to the fact that we are a sentimental race. Partly because the medium of the English newspaper is a foreign term, and it is not easy to write simply and at the same time forcefully. But the real reason is that all of us suffer from any number of complexes due to long repression and subjection, and every outlet is apt to be surcharged with emotion. Among the Indian owned English newspapers, the Hindu of Madras is probably the best so far as get up and news service are concerned. Our experience of 1930 and 1932 showed that it was easily possible for us to organize a secret network of information all over India. Without much effort and in spite of some opposition, good results were produced. Gandhiji condemned all secrecy in July 1939. Again, no tax movements flourished for some time in Gujarat and Karnataka apart from the UP. In Western countries, a strong public opinion has been built up in favor of civil liberties, and any limitation of them is resented and opposed. It is a little absurd to discuss this question of freedom or mind in prison in India when, as it happens, the vast majority of the prisoners are not allowed any newspapers or writing material. It is not a question of censorship but of total denial. Only A class prisoners are allowed writing materials as a matter of course, and not even all these are allowed daily newspaper. So I occupied myself with my books, going from one type of reading to another, but usually sticking to heavy books. For 14 and a half months, I lived in my little cell or room, and I began to feel as if I was almost a part of it. I was familiar with every bit of it. I knew every mark and dent on the prison walls and on the uneven floor. I was not alone in my cell, for several colonies of wasps and hornets lived there, and many lizards found a home behind the rafters, emerging in the evening in search of prey. Only a prisoner who has been confined for long behind high walls can appreciate the extraordinary psychological value of these outside walks and open views. Outside, the struggle went on, and brave men and women continued to defy peacefully a powerful and entrenched government. The communist philosophy of life gave me comfort and hope. How was it to be applied to India? We had not solved yet the problem of political freedom, and the nationalistic outlook filled our mind. World events as well as happening in India were forcing the social issue to the front. And it seemed that political freedom could no longer be separated from it. Congress at present meant Gandhiji. What would he do? Ideologically, he was sometime amazingly backward, and yet in action, he had been the greatest revolutionary of recent times in India. He was a unique personality, and it was impossible to judge him by the usual standards or even to apply the ordinary canons of logic to him. But because he was a revolutionary at bottom and was pledged to political independence for India, he was bound to play an uncompromising role till the independence was achieved. And in this very process, he would release tremendous mass energies and would himself, I half hoped, advance step by step towards the social goal. What is religion? I felt angry with Gandhi at his religious and sentimental approach to a political question and his frequent references to God in connection with it. He even seemed to suggest that God had indicated the very date of the fast. What a terrible example to set. If Bapu died, what would India to be like? And how would her political run? So I thought, and confusion reigned in my head, and anger, and hopelessness, and love for him who was the cause of this upheaval. I hardly knew what to do, and I was irritable and short tempered with everybody, and most of all with myself. And then a strange thing happened to me. I had quite an emotional crisis, and at the end of it, I felt calmer, and the future seemed not so dark. Bapu had a curious knack of doing the right thing at the psychological moment, and it might be that his action, impossible to justify as it was from my point of view, would lead to great results, not only in the narrow field in which it was confined, but in the wider aspects of our national struggle. And even if Bapu died, our struggle for freedom would go on. So whatever happened, one must keep ready and fit for it. Having made up my mind to face even Gandhiji's death without flinching, I felt calm and collected and ready to face the world and all it might offer. Then came news of the tremendous upheaval all over the country, a magic wave of enthusiasm running through Hindu society. What a magician, I thought, was this little man Bapu sitting in prison, and how well he knew how to pull the strings that move people's heart. A telegram from Bapu reached me. It was the first message I had received from him since my conviction, and it did me good to hear from him after that long interval. In this telegram, Bapu said, during all these days of agony you have been before mind's eye, I am almost anxious to know your opinion. You know how I value your opinion. Indu looked happy and in possession of more flesh, doing very well. It was extraordinary, and yet it was characteristics of Bapu that in the agony of his fast and in the midst of his many preoccupations, he should refer to the visit of my daughter and my sister's children to him, and even mention that Indra had put on flesh. He never forgets the seemingly little things in life which really mean so much. Many months later, early in May 1933, Gandhiji began his 21-day fast. The first news of this had again come as a shock to me, but I accepted it. I had struggled against my utter disapproval of his act and my desire not to hurt him. Gandhiji survived the fast. On the first day off, he was discharged from prison, and on his advice, civil disobedience was suspended for 6 weeks. India is supposed to be a religious country above everything else, and Hindu and Muslim and Sikh and others take pride in their faiths and testify to their truth by breaking heads. The spectacle of what is called religion, or at any rate organized religion, in India and elsewhere has filled me with horror, and I have frequently condemned it and wished to make a clean sweep of it. But organized religion, whatever its past may have been, today is very largely an empty form devoid of real content. This does not mean that men of religion have not been and are not still often of the highest moral and spiritual type. But it does not mean that the religious outlook does not help and even hinders the moral and spiritual progress of people. If morality and spirituality are to be judged by this world standard and not by the hereafter, usually religion becomes an social quest for God or the absolute, and the religious man is concerned far more with his own salvation than with the good of society. Moral standards have no relation to social needs but are based on a highly metaphysical doctrine of sin. What then is religion? Probably it consists of the inner development of the individuals, the evolution of his consciousness in a certain direction which is considered good. What that direction is will again be a matter for debate. But as far as I understand it, religion lays stress on this inner change and considers outward change as but the projection of this inner development. There can be no doubt that this inner development powerfully influences the outer environment. It may be that individuals can rise above circumstances and environment and reach great inner heights. But for large groups and nations, a certain measure of external development is essential before the inner evolution can take place. A man who is the victim of economic circumstances and restricted by the struggle to live can very rarely achieve inner consciousness of any high degree. A class that is downtrodden and exploited can never progress inwardly. A nation which is politically and economically subject to another and hedged and circumscribed and exploited can never achieve inner growth. Thus, for inner development, external freedom and a suitable environment become necessary. No man can live without religion. Gandhiji has written somewhere. There are some who, in the egotism of their reason, declare that they have nothing to do with religion. But that is like a man saying that he breathes, but that he has no nose. Again, Gandhi says, my devotion to truth has drawn me into the field of politics. And I can say without the slightest hesitation, and yet in all humanity, that those who say that religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion means. The dual policy of the British government. Naked coercion, as India was experiencing, is an expensive affair for the rulers. Even for them, it was a painful and nerve shaking ordeal, and they know well that ultimately it weakens their foundation. It exposed continually the real character of their rule, both to the people coerced and the world at large. They infinitely prefer to put on the velvet glove to hide the iron fist. Nothing is more irritating and in the final analysis harmful to a government than to have to deal with people who will not bend to its will, whatever the consequences. Like nearly all Kashmiri Brahmins, our family was a meat eating one. And from childhood onwards, I had always taken meat. Politically, India was more or less quiet. Public activities were largely controlled and suppressed by the government, and arrests occasionally took place. But the silence of India then was full of significance. It was the ominous silence which follows exhaustion after experiencing a period of fierce oppression. India was the ideal police state, and the police mentally pervaded all spheres of government. Every person who had been to prison as a civil resister was unfit according to the government. Reports of Nazi excesses in Germany had a curious effect on British officials and their press in India. They gave them a justification for all they had done in India. I don't know what India will be like or what she will do when she is politically free. The British Labour Party is a powerful organization. It is backed by the trade unions with their millions of paying members and highly developed cooperative organization. It was natural and inevitable that Indian nationalism should resent alien rule. Our challenge to the British version of history, economics, and administration in India grew, and yet we continue to function within the orbit of British ideology. The political unity of India was achieved incidentally as a side product of the empire's advance. What a long time it is since the British came here, a century and three quarters since they became dominant. They had a free hand and a magnificent opportunity to mold India according to their desire. And yet, in spite of these changes, what is India like today? A servile state with its splendid strength caged up, hardly daring to breathe freely, governed by strangers, her people poor beyond compare, short lived, and incapable of resisting disease, illiteracy rampant, vast areas devoid of all sanitary or medical provision, unemployment, both among the middle classes and the masses. Freedom, democracy, socialism, communism are, we are told, the slogans of unpractical idealists. Indians have been accused of talking too much and doing little. It is just charge. But may we not express our wonder and the capacity of the British for committees and commissions, each of which, after long labor, produces a learned report, a great state document which is duly praised. And so we get the sensation of moving ahead of progress and yet have the advantage of remaining where we are. Honor is satisfied and vested interests remain untouched and secure. Other countries discuss how to get on. We discuss checks and breaks and safeguards. It would be absurd to cast the blame for all India's ills on the British. That responsibility must be shouldered by us, and we may not shirk it. It is unseemly to blame others for the consequences of our own weakness. We see what a class the British attract to themselves in India. Some of them are intellectually keen and capable of good work. They drift to government service or semi government service because of lack of opportunity elsewhere. And gradually they tone down and become just parts of the big machine, their mind imprisoned by the dull routine of work. They develop the qualities of bureaucracy, a competent knowledge of clerkship, and the diplomatic art of keeping office. At the highest, they have a passive devotion to the public service. But apart from this, the majority of petty officials are not an admirable lot. Their fault is not theirs. That is, the training of the system gives them. They have no ideals in service. The haunting fear of unemployment and consequent starvation pursues them. But as all the world knows, it is the white man who bears the burden of empire, not the brown. We have various imperial service to carry on the imperial tradition. The ICS were intellectually and emotionally not prepared for what happened. The original training of many of their members was classical, which gave them a certain culture and a certain charm. It was an old world attitude, suitable for the Victorian age, but utterly out of place under modern conditions. They lived in a narrow, circumscribed world of their own, Anglo-Indian, which was neither England nor India. There are, of course, many excellent men, both English and Indian, in the ICS, but so long as the present system prevails, their excellence will be devoted to objects which are not beneficial to the Indian people. One of the legends about India, which our English rulers have persistently circulated all over the world, is that India has several hundred languages. Of these several hundred, it is an extraordinary fact that very few Englishmen know even one moderately well, in spite of a long residence in this country. If the census tells us that India has 200 or 300 languages, it also tells us, I believe, that Germany has about 50 or 60 languages. I have no doubt whatever that Hindustani is going to be the common language of India. Indeed, it is largely so today for ordinary purpose. Its progress has been hampered by foolish controversies about the script, Persian, and by the misdirected efforts of the two factions to use language which is either too Sanskritized or too Persianized. The new nationalism then grew up from above, the upper class English speaking, and this was naturally confined to the Hindus. For the Muslims were educationally very backward. Lack of English education was itself a sufficient bar so far as the Muslims were concerned, but this was bound to get gradually. With foresight, the British provide for the future, and in this task they were helped by an outstanding personality, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. Sir Syed was unhappy about the backward condition of his community, especially in education, and he was distressed at the lack of favor and influence it had in the eyes of the British government. Like many of his contemporaries, Sir Syed was a great admirer of the British, and a visit to Europe seems to have had a most powerful effect on him. When Sir Syed visited Britain, he was tremendously impressed. English education meant government jobs, security, influence, honor. So, to this education, he turned all his energy, tried to win over his community to his way of thinking. He wanted no diversions or distractions from other direction. It was a difficult enough piece of work to overcome the inertia and hesitation of the Muslims. The Hindus half a century ahead in Western education. Sir Syed's decision to concentrate on Western education for Muslims was undoubtedly a right one. Without that, they could not have played any effective part in the building up of Indian nationalism of the new type, and they would have been doomed to play second fiddle to the Hindus with their better education and far stronger economic position. The Muslims were not historically or ideologically ready. Sir Syed's activities, therefore, although seemingly very moderate, were in the right direction. The Muslims were still wrapped up in feudal anti-democratic ideology, while the rising middle class among the Hindus had begun to think in terms of the European liberals. Sir Syed's moderation was the moderation of the landlord class to which the handful of well-to-do Muslims belonged. The Hindus' moderation was that of a cautious professional or businessman seeking an outlet for industry and investment. These Hindu politicians look up to the shining lights of English liberalism. I doubt if the Muslim did so. Sir Syed's dominating and forceful personality impressed itself on the Indian Muslims, and the Aligarh College became the hope of his desires. Aligarh College did fine work, produced a large number of competent men, and changed the whole tone of the Muslim. But still, It could not wholly get out of the framework in which it was built. A feudal spirit reigned over it, and the goal of the average student's ambition was government service. But the most extraordinary exhibition of anti nationalism and reaction, both on the part of Muslim and Hindu, took place at the Round Table Conference. The British government had insisted on nominating only definitely communal Muslims, and these, under the leadership of the Aga Khan, actually went to the length of aligning themselves with the most reactionary and from the point of view not only of India but of all progressive group. It was quite extraordinary to see the close association of the Aga Khan and his group with Lord Lloyd and his party. Stress has been laid on the Muslim nation in India, on Muslim culture, on the utter incomparable of Hindu and Muslim cultures. The inevitable deduction from this is that the British must remain in India forever or ever to hold the scales and mediate between the two cultures. The Muslim nation in India, a nation within a nation, and not even compact but a vague spread out. Politically, the idea is absurd economically. It is hardly worth considering. To talk of a Muslim nation, therefore, means that there is no nation at all but a religious bonds. It means that no nation in the modern sense must be allowed to grow. It means that modern civilization should be discarded and we should go back to the medieval ways. It means autocratic government or a foreign government. There are certainly many differences between the traditional Hindu and Muslim philosophies of life, but these differences are hardly noticeable when both of them are compared to the modern scientific and industrial outlook on life. For between this latter and the former two, there is a vast gulf. The real struggle today in India is not between Hindu culture and Muslim culture, but between these two and the conquering scientific culture of modern civilization. Those who are desirous of preserving Muslim culture, whatever that may be, need not worry about Hindu culture, but should withstand the giant from the West. I have no doubt that all efforts, Hindu or Muslim, to oppose modern scientific and industrial civilization are doomed to failure, and I shall watch this failure without regret. Our choice was unconsciously and involuntarily made when railways and the like came here. Sir Syed Ahmed Khan made his choice on behalf of the Indian Muslims when he started the Aligarh College. But what is this Muslim culture? Is it a kind of racial memory of the great deeds of the Arabs, Persian, Turks? Or language, or art and music, or customs? I don't remember anyone referring to present day Muslim art or Muslim music. The two languages which have influenced Muslim thought in India are Arabic and Persian. But the influence of Persian has no element of religion about it. The Persian language and many Persian customs and tradition came to India in the course of thousands of years and impressed themselves powerfully all over North India. Persia was the France of the East, sending its language and culture to all its neighbors. That is a common and precious heritage for all of us in India. I have tried hard to understand what this Muslim culture is, but I confess that I have not succeeded. I find a tiny handful of middle class Muslims as well as Hindus in North India influenced by the Persian language and tradition. And looking to the masses, the most obvious symbol of Muslim culture seemed to be a particular type of pajamas, not too long and not too short, a particular way of shaving or clipping the mustache, but allowing the beard to grow, and a lota with a special kind of snout.